Hello and welcome to the program. 5 years have passed since Russia illegally annexed Crimea and the city of Sevastopol in March 18th in 2014. This act was a serious violation of international law and a challenge to the established international order. And the West did not recognize the annexation, in response to which sanctions against Russia were introduced. To talk more about this, we welcome to the studio Anton Korynevych, Associate Professor of International Law. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So, first, recently the European Union urged United Nations member states to introduce sanctions against Russia, and this was stated on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea by Federica Mogherini, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. I suggest that now we listen to a soundbite of her stating that.
The increasing militarization of Crimea and Sevastopol over this period has had a negative impact on the security situation in the whole Black Sea region. Dangerous increase of tensions at the Kerch Strait in November was another consequence of the illegal annexation. The European Union expects Russia to release the captured Ukrainian crew members and vessels unconditionally and without further delay. And on Friday, as you know, we added 8 persons involved in this incident to the list of those subject to restrictive measures.
Now, it is yet another announcement. Is this signal just another signal, or is it clear enough? Does it change anything on the EU's policy towards Russia?
It looks that there is no real change towards the policy of EU towards Russia. We do see that European Union for these 5 years has always mentioned and stressed that it doesn't recognize the outcomes and the results of the so-called referendum, and it doesn't recognize that Crimea is part of Russian Federation now, that it does recognize that Crimea still is a territory, a part of the territory of Ukraine. So this, let's say, the policy of unrecognition, it resembles the same. It is important that EU understands that the events near the Kerch Strait in November 2018 were part of a big, let's say, armed conflict, the international armed conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine in relation to Crimea, and that the Russian Federation needs to release immediately and without any proofs and subjects the captured Ukrainian sailors. So that we do see that EU is ready to add to this picture of the occupation of Crimea, these new episodes that can arise. And of course it is important that EU calls other UN nations, UN member states, to impose sanctions, restrictive measures as to Russian Federation and as to persons who are responsible for violations of international law in relation to Crimea. So this policy remains, and this is an important signal.
So for you, what's important is the consistency and the coherence of this policy, not necessarily, because the problem is the effective means of this, and how can Russia, hear that kind of thing? Because obviously, since the beginning, Russia hasn't reacted and didn't continue to deny its role.
Well, yes, but still in international law we do have this concept of persistent objector, when the states or international organizations, in this very issue instance EU, persistently objects to the fact that Crimea is not part of Russia. So this continuation of policy is very important for the international legal side of affairs. But of course we do understand that the Russian Federation has not changed its attitude, its current stage of affairs regarding Crimea, regarding Ukraine, but still it doesn't mean that international community shall not do anything. International community, Ukraine, both shall react to this and shall talk to Russia in the language of sanctions, restrictive measures, restrictions, to show that the Russian understanding of situation, the Russian understanding of the status of Crimea is absolutely wrong.
And it's interesting that you talk about the international community here, because also earlier today the Atlantic Council opposed to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, human rights violations on the peninsula, and the military build-up in the annexed region. Does the Atlantic Council, on that matter, does NATO have more power than the EU? Does it have more influence, let's say?
Well, I would say that EU is more important for the Russian Federation when we talk about economics and trade, because EU was and is a partner of Russian Federation in the economic context. But NATO is a kind of a threat which always occurred for Russian Federation, and we may say that Russian Federation has done this all in Crimea because of these preventive measures or preemptive measures in order not to let NATO to come to Ukraine or to Crimea.
At least that's a narrative of Russia.
Of course, that's what a lot of Russian politicians say, that if we didn't do that, the NATO would have been in Feodosia or in Kerch or whatever. So that NATO is a kind of a permanent threat to Russian Federation and let's say permanent opponent. So I think that the NATO's, again, unrecognition policy is important, so that Russia sees that both its partners and both its opponents do consider the Russians' actions illegal.
But here there is this sort of, like, I wouldn't say contradiction, but a dilemma. How can NATO still be acting in the region without being the constant, let's say, boogeyman used by Russia and, in a way, play into the narrative of Russia?
Well, I think that NATO shall think about the strengthening the position in the Black Sea region, taking into account that in Black Sea region we do have NATO member states, they do have navies, they do have armed forces, so that I think that NATO shall understand the threat which now the Russian Federation poses in the Black Sea region, taking into account that Crimea is now highly and heavily militarized. It is full of weaponry, it is full of missiles, it is full of army and armed men. So that I think that NATO does think how to react and how to act in this Black Sea region. And I think that for NATO it is important that Ukraine also is rather strong and can oppose Russian threats in this region.
Yeah, because the idea is not to endanger Ukraine either without. Now, coming back to the sanctions, Russia's economy has lost 150 billion US dollars over the 5 years of illegal annexation of Crimea. Now, this is according to analysts of Bloomberg Economics. How long is it going to last? How, do you think it's on the long term, Russia is going to be able to continue to lose money over Crimea?
Well, I think that in order to have a fully-fledged analysis of this, we need to be inside the Russian economic system to be aware of the fact how long can Russia work and live economically with all that restrictions and sanctions and money losses. But what we see that there are some symbolic things and some, I would say, military things which are important now for Russia regarding Crimea. We know that for Russian Federation, Crimea was a kind of symbolic thing, and that the Russian president was highly praised by the Russian population for that actions. The other issue is militarization. The Russian Federation puts a lot of money, a lot of effort and resources into militarization of Crimea, and this means a lot of money, because they send missiles, new weaponry, army men who needs to have salaries. They build this bridge, they build some electric stations and all these things. So they really spend a lot of money for militarization, and it's of course a big economic dilemma. How long this militarization would prevail in relation to the economic threats. But I think that we will find out this in the nearest future.
Yeah, because this money doesn't go into Russian economy. So in the end, on the long term, you would say that it is a loss for Russia, basically.
Of course. That's how Soviet Union was ended, due to this army race with another state.
Like basically the unbalance between economic...
It looks like it's a situation which really resembles that one.
Now, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said, and you talked about militarization of Crimea, that Russia has indeed strengthened the grouping of troops in Crimea, according to him. Okay? It provides, quote, protection of the territory of the peninsula and the interests of Russia in the Black Sea. What are really the main interests of Russia in the Black Sea?
Well, I think that here Russian minister talks about the issue that Crimea is really a point on a map which gives you the ability to control all the actions in the Black Sea region. I mean, even without use of the navy, of the warships, with the help of missiles or whatever, you can control all the situation in the Black Sea. So Crimea now does look as a military base with new weaponry, with a lot of men, a lot of missiles, which helps Russia to control and to put efforts in control of the Black Sea region. So I would say that talking militarily about the strategic issues, Crimea gives this ability to be an important player in the Black Sea region.
Now, how do you see, and to conclude this interview, how do you see the elections are coming soon in Ukraine? It's going to be a major, this year, it's going to be a turning point, at least for Ukraine. How do you see all that evolving? Do you see a continuation between some elections also in Western countries? I'm thinking Germany, I'm thinking all these other countries. Do you see these sanctions continuing, and do you see this strengthening of sanctions and pressure over Russia continuing, or do you see, I don't know, some allies of Russia trying to lift the sanctions? How do you see it evolve, let's say, in 5-10 years?
We may not know the answer to the question whether the sanctions will be strengthened, but the sanctions will remain in their place and the pressure will remain in the place, because what did Russia commit in Crimea? It committed grave or serious violation of international law, as you quoted. So it means that international community, which still lives under international law and which has this, I would say, rules of play, which are governed by rule of law, rule of play governed by international law, they need to react on the issues, on the facts which Russia committed in Crimea. So that how do they react? They make some statements, as we quoted in the beginning of the program, and then they strengthen the statements by the actions. So these actions are sanctions, restrictions, restrictive measures, and pressure. So I think that they will remain at their place.
Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio to talk about Russian sanctions and the situation in Crimea. That was Anton Korynevych, Associate Professor of International Law. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.